I'm a solo business owner and a solo marketer rolled in one. So I have kind of different systems that work for me that allow me not to kind of work from scratch and maximize my resources in a way. So it's a bit double-sided. So when you have these 3 layers in place, you're kind of covering everything, but you're not going to sit down and do a full-fledged 6 months of work and thinking all of these things, brainstorming all of these things, workshopping. Nothing interesting happens in that space. I always recommend give it 4 to 6 weeks, do a minimum effective content strategy, create an execution plan, go at it for 3 months, evaluate and refine.
You're listening to Content Logistics,
a podcast for B2B marketers where we explore the foundational
and sometimes frustrating elements of content.
We're talking to the experts, learning all their tips and tricks, and sharing them with you.
We don't gatekeep here. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Content Logistics. I'm your host, Dallion, and I'm here with my co-host, Baylee. We have another really special and exciting episode for you today. We have Mina Mesbahi on our show. This is actually her first podcast, and I'm so excited for you all to hear from her. Mina is on a mission to make content marketing simple and profitable. She helps you leave the hamster wheel energy behind and say hello to effective content marketing. She has been consulting for the last 9+ years. She's been helping people scale their content programs for startups and B2B corporations. I cannot wait for you to hear from her.
Our topic today focuses on building a unified content strategy. We know so many businesses, when you're really scrappy, sometimes the content can be a bit disjointed, coming from several different sources. So today we are talking about how to unify that content strategy, fill in any content gaps that are there. And Mina has a really special strategy for building what she calls a minimum effective strategy. She has an engineering background, so kind of hitting on a minimal viable product, something along the lines of that, of just how you can really just get the ball rolling with what you've got. So let's get into it.
Hi, Mina. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. I'm so excited to be having this chat with you guys.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you here too, Mina. You have such a unique background as a content marketing strategist with an engineering foundation. That's something so unique that I think you're the first we've had on the show like this. But can you tell us just a little bit about your journey? How did your unusual start influence your approach in content marketing?
Yeah, and honestly, I love this question because I don't get to talk about it as much on LinkedIn. It's just one of those things that it feels so far in the past because it's like years ago now. I don't know, maybe it's 10, 12 years ago. So I don't really talk about it much, but I love it. And I think it has really informed the way I think about content and I approach content. I actually never wanted to be a marketer. I think a lot of us in the marketing space have that in common. We don't have marketing backgrounds. I know some people look down on that, but we don't. In this corner of the internet, we don't. So yeah, I studied engineering. I actually kind of wanted to be an engineer. And after kind of a while, I was like, I don't think this is really for me. And yeah, it just one path led to another. I don't want to bore you with the details. But at some point, I just started a blog because I was bored and I was like, why not? And I just started blogging and I started to learn about SEO and building an email list, building newsletters. Before I knew it, kind of I had brands starting to reach out to me, not only just to create content for them, but also showcase their products on my blog and other channels I had back then. I think I was pretty active on Instagram and Pinterest. So I have like a B2C start, which is kind of really surprising. And yeah, I started kind of creating blog content and all sorts of social media content from there. And after a while, I transitioned into B2B. And when I kind of think about this transition, when I joined the B2B space, I did not realize how little respect marketers get. Like a lot of times, especially if you were in B2B tech, which was kind of the space for me was predominantly clean tech, you don't get a lot of respect. They kind of view the marketing department as the coloring department or as the nice add-on, etc. But what I found is that in comparison with my other colleagues, I tend to kind of get a little bit more respect, and it was easier for me to get SME interviews. And honestly, it was easier also to conduct the interviews, because when I was preparing for calls and things like that, I would kind of read material that was a bit more scientific, research papers, and kind of research also the person. I just had, better questions, I suppose, to ask. So it just became kind of a thing that I was like, oh, this is actually, it's coming together. I studied engineering and it kind of wasn't for nothing. And it made creating content easier. It opened more doors for me, and it kind of allowed me to not become a subject matter expert, but really have a seat at the table from the expertise perspective, but also on a strategic level. Because what happens is when you're in the company, you have kind of, you're just doing more automatically, your voice is heard more. So it opened kind of that door for me. And now that I look back at it, being kind of a consultant and strategist, I have a very methodical approach when it comes to strategy. I'm very action based. I don't know if you've seen my content on LinkedIn. I create a lot of kind of flow charts, things like that, because that's how my brain works. I did not realize it until other people started pointing it to me. That is like, oh, actually your engineering background, like this methodical background is really showing. So that's why I always think, okay, if a content strategy is not action based, it's like, it's not helpful. Like, I don't approach it from this perspective of having all of these interesting ideas. I mean, I'm all about also creativity, but having the structure, having the milestones and layers and things like that. So I feel like it has really informed, it has helped me in my career. It has given me a leg up, but it has really informed the way I think about content strategy and create content myself on LinkedIn.
Mina, I just wanted to tell you that off the top that I've been following you for a while, and I've been really excited to meet you. And when we started this show, you were like one of the first people on my list that I was like, we have to bring her on the show. So this is like so cool. And your content is so interesting to me because of everything you just said, how methodical you are and the way that you structure the process and the way that you structure content strategy is really fascinating. So just wanted to say that I'm a fangirl.
I love that. I mean, that means so much, honestly, because I mean, you don't get to speak with everyone on LinkedIn, but trust me, when somebody says something like that, I am probably fangirling more for you that you're just like sharing this feedback with me. It means so much. And I'm so glad we're having the chat. Like, I am blushing for the people who are listening and don't have the video. Like, I don't handle compliments very well.
Well, I think your background really gives you a unique perspective and how much an edge in this industry. But just kind of bringing it back to our topic, we want to talk about how to help businesses build a unified content strategy. And I know a lot of B2B businesses in particular really struggle to connect their content across different channels. There's so many different channels, so many different topics that can be discussed. But what would you say are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to creating a unified content experience?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, because I think from the first stop, a lot of people don't even think about it. I often get on discovery calls and they say, oh, we have an agency doing the podcast, and we have an agency doing the blog, and we have somebody in-house whenever we're doing events or when we have any launch doing the social content. So you have this kind of disjointed experience because they don't think about it. Okay, how can we have a single growth roadmap that actually ties all of these touch points together? And honestly, I think a lot of it kind of stems from they don't know what to say, because when you think of a unified content strategy, I always call it like platform proof, platform agnostic. It doesn't start with the things you need to do. It doesn't start with if you need to have a blog. It doesn't start if you need to have a webinar. It starts with the core messages, your perspective as a brand, and the things you want to continuously reinforce with your audience. I think that lack of clarity, then you're always chasing different ideas and different tactical actions and different formats on, the channels you're active on, to just kind of check the mark or say, oh, we are present, see what sticks, kind of this throwing spaghetti at the wall, kind of throwing these tactics at the wall. So they don't even sit down and consider that, okay, what is it we need to say, and then we go and see how we can actually amplify it and deliver it in the right format, in the right channels. So the challenge is really not knowing that's what you need. They think, okay, and there is room for, when you have that unified strategy, to have that sub action plans, execution plans for each platform, because obviously each platform has its own ways of delivering content. People prefer to consume content in different ways. Like, you're not going to slap the same content on LinkedIn and go put it on TikTok. It's just, that is not the point of this, but really understanding the message and also your goals. And I'm not just talking about revenues and leads, because when you think of content, it needs to be translated to something a little bit more micro. You have so many touch points. That 7 number, by the way, I think is absolutely inaccurate by now, because you have all of these micro touch points. So think of really the message you want to say first. Companies don't think that, because either they don't know what they stand for, so they don't know how to stand out, because let's be real, you cannot stand out if you don't stand for anything. Or they just want to cater to everyone, total addressable market. So they are not gonna go specific on their ideal client, ideal customer, to understand what they need to actually say to them. Or they're kind of a little bit too obsessed with drinking their own Kool-Aid. So finding that sweet spot of how are we going to position ourselves in a way that resonates with them, that's a huge gap in most, and honestly a blind spot rather than a gap, because most companies don't even realize they have it. So they have this disjointed content experience that is just, you end up with a lot of body of content that's going nowhere.
Yeah. I like your point of kind of bringing it back to the why you're doing content, remembering your target market. Man, I feel like we talk about this all the time. You got to get back to your target market. One thought that I had as you're just talking is, sometimes when these companies are starting, they don't really know what their messaging should be like. So I think it's totally fine to use maybe a platform to test some ideas and test what resonates with your audience. Probably LinkedIn is a really good place to do that, because it's like so obvious who's engaging, so you get a return really quickly on what's resonating.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, actually, because a lot of this process, I know I say it in a way that is set in stone, but it's not. I always say refinement is revenue. Like, refinement is where it's at. A lot of times, even if you are a little bit more advanced, you have still a layer that you need to test, because it might be the message is right, but the delivery is not right, or how you're actually kind of the formats you're playing with, things like that. And absolutely, like, if you are still in that, you're trying to find market fit, or you have found market fit, you're still in the earlier stages of creating content, absolutely, you need to test things, but you also need to give it time. And this process never ends. Like, content strategy is not a one-off activity. I always say that. You kind of have to continuously refine as you go and repeat things. You also have to, you shouldn't be afraid of repeating it, because without it, you also don't know what's working or not. If you share one message in only one way, one time, good luck. How's that going to stick? How are you going to have enough data and enough feedback, even outside of the analytics of kind of any platform, even qualitative feedback? You're not going to have enough feedback, enough data to even assess whether it's working or not. So that is such a good point. I'm glad you brought it up, because I don't want it to come across as, oh, this is set in stone. You know exactly what you stand for. There is a layer of assumption always to it. And even if on a brand perspective, you know that when it comes to content, you still have to test quite a lot and refine. I mean, even if you have something that's working, I guarantee it's not going to work forever, because if you have something really interesting, other people are going to steal it. Other people are going to try to replicate it. Or what happens is sometimes the market changes, or your ICP changes, and things are not going to always work as well as they do. So you have to keep refining. You have to keep changing things. It's just part of the game. I think there is this idea that, oh, if you have a strategy, or if you know what you're doing, then you're always in the green. I would argue, if you're always in the green, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, I know Dallion and we have clients sometimes that have these really old school thoughts about content. Like, we have to post a blog post every week on a specific day to be consistent, when, like you said before, we really should go back to the why and like really what content is resonating with our audience. And it, it really doesn't matter if you're posting this blog post consistently every week. Sure, that can help, but maybe you're not quite there to that step yet.
100%. You nailed it. It's like filler content, right? I remember having a conversation once in a discovery call. I mean, luckily I don't have these conversations often, to be honest, because my content is such a repellent. But they mentioned that they were they don't have any events for the next 3 months. So they have no content to put out, and they want to see if they can repurpose the same announcements or whatever, just to show face, just to show up and say, we have content. That's such a waste of resources. And they were a small team, which even breaks my heart more, because as a small team, you need to be even more strategic, because your time is so limited. Your resources, I mean, time is a resource, but everything is so limited. So you have to like really avoid filler content at all costs. And honestly, people don't care. Not that they don't remember if you're posting or not, but they don't care if you are posting a blog or a LinkedIn on Wednesday at a LinkedIn post, on Wednesday at 10 a.m. or not. Or another thing is, people get a little bit stuck on what percentage of your content is what. Like they say 20% of the content needs to be promotional, like all of these pillars that are anything but strategic. Your audience does not care. They just care about themselves. And honestly, that's a good thing. I'm glad they are selfish, because that allows us to do things in ways that also work for us, like at the schedule that work for us, at the cadence that works for us. But yeah, we need to really think about kind of the why, again, on a macro level, not just that, oh, we want revenue from this blog. That's not how, we have to kind of look at it from a macro perspective, what our goal is, where is this person, what is their current experience, what is their point A, and what would be their point B after this kind of content is published, and what is our perspective? What are we going to weave into here? Are we just going to put out vanilla content to check the box because we needed that blog published on Wednesday? Or are we going to actually really take the time and make this right? Maybe then you have a cadence that is bi-weekly. That is so much more impactful and powerful than keeping consistent. Like, I'm all about consistency and having a solid cadence, but you have to balance it.
Yeah, I mean, consistency is great when you have valuable pieces of content to be consistent with. And I think maybe like in the earlier days of social media, when influencers and things started to come on the scene, people, like, the word got out that consistency is key and that consistency is important. And like, people latched onto that, like, and they're still on it, like, 5-6 years later. And it just, yeah, you got to have something to be consistent with. And to that point, when you help people build out their roadmap, or I think you have a couple of different ways of calling it, like a minimum effective content strategy. Yeah. What does that mean to you? And how does this work for people?
Yeah, especially when you're transitioning from not having a strategy. I mean, there's different kind of scenarios. You're already creating content, which is honestly most people is they are already creating content, and then you're kind of at ground zero and you haven't done anything. There is really no such thing as going from 0 to 100. There's no such thing as going from 0 to a full-fledged content strategy, because as I mentioned, there is a refinement aspect to it. There is this kind of messy middle, but you need to have something as a starting point. And I like to call it minimum effective, because minimum viable sounds like, oh, it's just viable. But no, this is supposed to be effective. It's not just to have a document or a roadmap to say we have it for the sake of it, but it needs to actually do what it needs to do. Like, your content needs to be doing its job. So that's kind of how I look at it. And with strategy, as it's so abstract, and even when I worked in-house, I wish I followed this process, because it would make life easier. But especially now that I sell strategy as a service, it's even more important that you break it down. So I look at it through 3 layers, and these layers allow you to have certain milestones in place. So you're like, okay, by this milestone, we need to have achieved this and this. These are the things we need, and this is the output of that. And what are we going to do with it? And how is this going to inform our kind of content planning and calendar? The layers for me that has worked well, that kind of takes into account everything, is direction. So basically the goals, where you're going, why you're going there, what is the best kind of mode of transportation, who you're taking with you, kind of all of those things. And the differentiation, as I mentioned, is so important to have a perspective, but also beyond the perspective, the delivery of the content, kind of that's another important aspect that gets lost. The content UX, how you're going to be delivering the messages, kind of those nitty gritty aspects of that. And the amplification, because if you're doing everything, if you're sharing content, at the end of the day, you need to also have the operation side and the distribution side baked into the strategy, because otherwise it becomes an afterthought. And when I talk about amplification, it's not just amplifying the content. So it's not just slicing and dicing or doing paid distribution or other ways of distribution. It's really amplifying the message. So what are the ways we're going to creatively repeat the message, but it's also amplifying your resources. This could be systems, this could be automations you have, this could be frameworks that are rinse and repeat that you can rely on. Like I'm a solo business owner and a solo marketer rolled in one. So I have kind of different systems that work for me that allow me not to kind of work from scratch and maximize my resources in a way. So it's a bit double-sided. So when you have these 3 layers in place, you're kind of covering everything, but you're not going to sit down and do a full-fledged 6 months of work and thinking all of these things, brainstorming all of these things, workshopping. Nothing interesting happens in that space. I always recommend give it 4 to 6 weeks, do a minimum effective content strategy, create an execution plan, go at it for 3 months, evaluate and refine. In the space in between, you still need to have some assessment milestones, like some bi-weekly touch points and monthly touch points, but you're not changing the strategy then. You're only kind of look at it maybe bi-weekly, depending on your cadence, you're looking at it on a channel level. On a monthly basis, maybe you're also looking at it from the operational aspect to kind of see what are the bottlenecks and things like that. But then you're looking at the strategy on a quarterly basis. And depending again on where you are at the kind of at which stage of growth you are, it might be that you don't even revisit the strategy for 6 months because you have dialed everything in so well. But in the beginning, that's kind of how you should go about it. Don't take months, 3 months, 2 months to kind of come up with a strategy. And honestly, even when you have the first and second layer, I always tell people, let's start publishing based on the strategy, because the amplification anyway, you need to have something to work with. You need to have wheels in motion to see where your gaps are in terms of where you're wasting resources, or where you could build better systems, or where you could actually set up automations. And amplifying the message and content, you need to have the stuff out there already to see what's worth amplifying, because that's kind of the goal. We're not going to just amplify for the sake of it because it's part of our strategy. We need to have something worth amplifying. So once you're done with the first 2 layers, you gotta go. And then this kind of happens in parallel. So that's why it's so important that you don't look at it as, oh, we have a strategy and it's done, let's go and never look at it again. It's not, that's not how it should be.
We agree. Yeah, we do the same thing. Quarterly strategies, review what's worked, what hasn't worked, and go from there. I want to go back to what you said about your 3 steps. So we start with direction. And then from there, was it differentiation?
Yes.
And then amplification.
Amplification.
Okay.
Yeah. And then kind of the last layer, which happens outside of the strategy, is execution and iteration. But it's kind of the DDA framework. I always say it. It's something that kind of covers everything.
Wonderful. That's such a great framework to get people started. And I like how they can all work in tandem, because sometimes we get stuck in that analysis paralysis, like afraid to put out content, and just starting helps so much so you can keep running that engine and moving forward.
100%. Even for me, I need to know kind of, okay, what are the missing pieces? What we need to still kind of work on. It really is helpful to have those milestones, even when you are working as a strategist, even if you're not thinking about getting buy-in, if you work internally, because it's important to show what you're doing and the thought process behind it. And what I find with C-levels and executives, when you show them milestones and what is associated with each milestone and the phases, they really tend to understand things better. But even if you're working like me, someone who works as a consultant, it just makes things a lot easier, like alignment with the client, because it's such an abstract thing. People are like, okay, what is exactly the strategy? What goes in it? What can we expect? And you have the timelines, you have the things, the milestone that you need to have certain things done, what elements go in there. So it's really helpful when you break it down into phases. It also allows you to know why you're doing what you're doing.
So I think from here, let's imagine we got a small team. They maybe have been posting some content for a little bit and they're like, Mina, how do I make sure my content is unified? Where should I go from here? What would you say would be the first step for them?
Yeah, this is a tough one, because sometimes you really have to kind of accept what you have done. It's just, you have to kind of scratch. It is what it is. And it's just, you cannot save it, right? And it is a tough thing to accept. And sometimes it could be 80% of what you have done. I would recommend that you look at your gaps first. I'm like a huge fan of not starting from scratch. You see, I'm a strategist, maybe because I'm a bit lazy with it. I always like to say, like, a lazy strategic marketer. Don't start from scratch. Look at your gaps first and see where those gaps are based on this layer. Actually, this kind of, the framework, it gives you a nice blueprint. I'm actually sharing a checklist for this, maybe this week or next week. I think by the time this episode goes live, could be already available. So for each phase, there is these mini milestones that you can see kind of what you need. I would say go back and look at your gaps first and see where you need to fill the gaps, and look at your past content. Let's say for the last 6 months or so. Again, this depends on your cadence. If you are publishing a ton, maybe last 6 months still too much to work with, maybe look at the last 3 months and see what is worth amplifying for where you are, and start creating a plan to rejig, repackage this content either on the existing channel. Like, let's say the original asset is a blog on your website, right? If it's already performing well, it's subjective, depends on the goal of the asset. If it's performing well, then what you can do is how you can actually distribute it on other channels. Maybe you can put it on social. You can, obviously not the blog directly. Please do not do that. See how you can actually repurpose it into different pieces of content, or how you can actually recreate it. Maybe it's something relevant for your sales team. This is obviously for sales-led companies. That is an asset that you can share with them, that they can also share with prospects. So there's like different ways that you can amplify this existing piece. So if something is working well already, find ways to amplify it. Use these layers of this kind of framework to see where your gaps are, fill those gaps, and now create content based on those gaps. See what's missing in your planning, and then connect the dots from there. But as a rule of thumb, really, when you start doing this, never look at a channel in isolation. If you're putting something on a podcast, if you're doing a webinar on something, it should never be a one-off activity. It should never be a random act that you say, okay, we're just going to do a webinar on this topic to see how it works. Nee, you have to get, by the way, this is like the German Dutch speaking coming out. Nee. I speak like 4 or 5 languages and none of them well, I always say. So just for the listeners, that is the European coming out. Well, I'm not European really, but now, yeah. So what you need to do is kind of think about how we're going to put the same message on the other channels. It doesn't have to be in a webinar format. You don't even have to repurpose the webinar if you don't want to, because sometimes it's hard to repurpose an asset if you haven't thought about it. Like webinars could be these really long storylines that they don't have sound bites, but find the messages and see how you can create the message in different ways on other channels. So really the mindset aspect of it, no more one-off activities, focus on what is working, amplify it, and what should have worked. That's another aspect of it, because a lot of times what happens is it's good advice, double down on what's working. But what happens is there are messages that should have worked better. because you already know based on your existing users, existing customers, existing clients, that this is something that resonates with them. There is a reason. Maybe it was the delivery, maybe it was the format, maybe it was the hook, maybe it was the CTA. It can be as macro as the delivery, it can be as macro as a CTA. Go back also to those assets. It could be a small social media post, it could be a blog post. I like to call them kind of these two different categories, oldies but goodies. So the things that work well, and then hidden treasures. The hidden treasure is this, something that should have performed well. Go back and see how you can actually fix that. And then start filling in those gaps as you go kind of in parallel. Instead of now thinking, oh, we're not going to publish anything, we're never going to use anything we have done, and start from scratch. That process is very overwhelming. And it's why a lot of teams just keep on going without a strategy, because they just don't know how to pause. They don't want to pause. They cannot afford to pause. You don't have to pause. You can just first fill in your gaps, amplify what's working, revisit your hidden treasures, and then go from there. And kind of once you have more insights, start putting a growth roadmap together. It's really helpful from the beginning. Just document everything. It's so funny because I used to be so anti-documentation. I remember my first manager would always kind of chase me. I don't see anything, like any brief about this. I'm like, it's in my head. I know it all. Like, I was just so bad at documenting, and now I can't live without it. And it's a big process. You have to have everything documented. If it's not documented, it does not exist.
Yeah. Got to keep a record of that stuff. I love how this approach is very accessible for teams, really just using what you already have. For people who maybe don't have content, something that I know has worked really well for me is to get my clients to just turn on the recording whenever they're talking. So like if they're having an internal discussion about the specific strategy, or if they're having a sales call, man, so many good nuggets from sales calls. I want them all recorded and sent over because you learn so much in those calls. But all those internal conversations, I wish I had known that sooner at my last jobs. I would have saved myself so much time trying to think of ideas when you're already talking about so much good potential content.
I love that. Absolutely. And I'm curious, how do you organize these things? Because that's another part of it. Do you keep like a central hub, like a Notion or Airtable, and then you kind of use it as like a content onboarding dashboard?
I'll say this is an area that we are currently working on being more organized in. We've got a rough plan, but kind of right now it's all just organized in our Google Drive, but definitely trying to get more organized in this area.
Yeah, but no, that's great. I think Drive is also great. Speaking of minimum effective, again, if you wait for having the perfect process and the perfect way of doing it, as long as you have access to everything and it's centralized, that is totally fine. But it's totally helpful, even if you are working with external folks, to have things that they can listen to, kind of get to know the product better, the customers better. Absolutely. I love that. That's such great advice, and something that they can go and implement today. So do not say this podcast was not action-based. This is one thing you can go and implement today.
What are some of the tools that you use to stay organized since you've converted to not documenting things?
I love Airtable. Like, absolutely. I manage my entire content on Airtable. Obviously, there's like lots of different tools on the client side, but for managing content, that's also what I always push on clients. I don't push, I suggest. I lovingly suggest. I'm not pushy. No, but it's really helpful. And I think Notion has a lot of similar capabilities, perhaps. I think a lot of people love Notion. I personally just love Airtable better. Maybe again, it's the techie in me. It's just easier. And also for keeping track of repurposing content, it has kind of this function that for me allows me to see all the repurposing history of a post on LinkedIn, for instance, because I repurpose so much, especially posting on LinkedIn for so long. But I don't want to lose track. I don't want to know when was the last time I did it. And it has like these little automation setups. I have this view that after 3 months, every content piece moves into that view for me to kind of think about the repurposing of it. It kind of goes there. And even with kind of stuff with client content, when I give them feedback, I have automation set up on there that I get the email, they get the email. Yeah, I just, anyway, for kind of managing the content, grouping things together, I love Airtable. And even if you have something like this, that you have recordings, I have also a lot of client call recordings, and I use ChatGPT sometimes, especially when I'm doing trainings and I'm doing a lot of like coaching. I have a custom GPT that actually takes conversations from calls. And when I'm stuck in a rut or I'm short on time, I just have a conversation with my higher self, with me when I was absolutely in my flow state. And I basically get content. It sounds like me. It's my ideas. It does not have to come up with anything. So I use also Airtable to kind of connect that to just keep a central overview of everything, so I can easily kind of create the custom GPT. But yeah, Airtable is my favorite tool. I use Miro as well. It's not so much as keeping organized, but keeping things centralized. So for content strategy, I map out everything on Miro. Like, it's just so much easier. You can drag things, you can brainstorm better. And they have some nice AI features now. For instance, for the client, for the ICP side, ideal customer profiling, I have a lot of sticky notes always with clients for dragging things and, brainstorming. You can actually select things and it summarizes points for you and it puts it in themes. So yeah, I love Miro also for staying organized in a way that is centralized, because if you have information in different documents in a Google Doc, on an Asana thread, it's not really helpful. So I also use Miro a lot for content strategy.
I love Miro too. I don't have that much experience with Airtable. I really should play around with it. I'm curious now.
You should. Maybe after our call, I show you like a little bit background what I meant with, I can share my screen maybe and show you what I meant with the repurposing part. It's really helpful. But yeah, it can be a little bit intimidating, but I can recommend it. I like it better than Notion.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
I hope Notion doesn't come for me.
We better have you back and you can show us your whole process on.
I would be happy to. Yeah, I would be happy to walk you through also my kind of how I think about organizing content strategy on Miro, because, there's different ways kind of you can do this, etc. I would love that. Sure.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, that is an area I would love to learn more about. So I think as we're kind of coming close to time, I want to know how you define success. We can measure content in so many different ways, but how would you define success for your clients?
That's such a good question. I look at content success in different layers. So I look at it kind of on the strategic level, which is really directly tied into the business metrics. So you have maybe kind of your recurring revenue, maybe you have your pipeline. It's different for every business depending on kind of your business model. Maybe it's cost of acquisition, kind of things like that. But that is too big. So I like to also go on the channel level as well and kind of look at it on a channel level and also on the operational level. So you're looking at the time you're saving, like all sorts of kind of the way you create content, how things have changed. Maybe you're getting more from your content and things like that. So kind of defining success, especially from the perspective of if you are, let's say, a B2B tech company, SaaS company, it's going to really depend on what you define success. Like a year ago, I worked with a client on a campaign and their main goal was really attracting talent. That's how we define success, right? That's going to be kind of something that's really important for them. They even went to events with that goal and we kind of did everything around that. So it's going to depend on what you want out of it. But if you ask me on a personal level, like on a Mina, what would Mina define success on a even micro level? Because of course I'm also a business owner, revenue is important, etc. But outside of that, because revenue is a byproduct of this, I think, to change how people think and act. That's kind of how you define success for content. If your content is helping people think and act differently, you have done your job, because everything else is going to be the byproduct of that.
And so how do you measure that?
For me, it's easy because I have a very simple business. I basically have a simple funnel. I have an opt-in funnel at the back end of my content, and I have the front end content. And I can always get direct feedback when I'm having discovery calls, when I have existing clients. Even I create content even for my clients that exist to kind of reassure them that I am the right choice, why they chose me. So I have direct access. I rely heavily for qualitative insights for this. And even for someone who does not become a client or somebody who's part of my audience, I'm always asking people on LinkedIn, what brought you to my corner of LinkedIn? Like if you have connected with me, the odds are you have gotten that question from me. So I rely heavily on qualitative data because I know I just cannot rely on the dashboards for me kind of to know that. But even if my business is also growing and it's going in the right direction, it's a signal for me that I'm doing something right. It's a tough one, I know. If you have a big operation, yeah.
I feel like that's a very ambitious goal to change the way people think, but something that we should aspire to just change people's thoughts and make a difference in the way we think.
Yeah, I mean, you have done that already with what you mentioned, that what people can do if they don't have content, just start recording things. Like that is a good example of, oh, I have not thought about it before. For someone who's in the trenches of beginning with their content, they would be like, oh, actually, I have not thought about doing that before. Or, oh, that's something that we should try. So you're changing like on a micro level. So it does not have to be this big thing of, oh, we're like impacting their lives now or whatever. Like it's content. It's not that deep, but it is something that is like, maybe this is something we should try. This is an interesting thought. That is an interesting perspective. I will kind of sit with this. Maybe it's not right away, but that's the thing about change. It requires repetition. That's why we always talk about creative repetition.
Yeah. Viewing that from a micro level makes it much more approachable. Just little things.
Action-based, yes.
Yeah.
We're not going to go for like category creation. I mean, that's kind of has its place and things like that. But when you think of content, you're creating these micro perspective shifts that add up to these macro actions people take. Book a demo, fill out your form, become a lead. So you have to kind of, that's what I mean by thinking and acting differently, really on a micro level and creating those aha moments, those perspective shifts.
I think we're both jumping to ask the same question. At the end of every show, we ask our guests the same question. So what is your biggest content marketing ick?
Oh, that is such a juicy question. Let me think about it. Can I have two? Kind of one on a more general level and one on more personal level, like more niche to what I do. The more general one is kind of this reductive content hook of, I read 100 books and I'm going to tell you what I learned in 3 minutes so you don't have to, like that kind of thing. Or I make $50,000 per month and these are the tools. I do that. I used to do that. Like, absolutely not. That's not how it works, right? It's not, and I think it originated probably from Twitter, well, X, kind of this thread boy style. And at some point it moved on to LinkedIn. That reductive hook kind of approach to content, no. This is a no for me. Major ick energy. By the way, this got my wheels turning for a content idea. Kind of big ick energy. Naya. Maybe this is something we need to cut out later. And on more something that is specific to what I do is steal my strategy. That is a no-go. I post Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays on LinkedIn. I post a carousel. I post a personal story. I post how I can help a client. I don't know, whatever it is. Steal my strategy. That is not a strategy, first of all. And even if it is, it cannot be stolen. You cannot, unless you have the same exact thing, but you will still blend in with everybody else. So that's still my strategy. That's gotta go. It is also major ick energy.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I don't get that. The stealing your strategy, because unless you are Mina, you can't do the same thing as someone else. Like it might work for a minute, but long term, no.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that.
Well, thank you so much, Mina, for joining us today on the show. It was so fun to talk through your thoughts on content strategy. I think we had lots of micro learning moments as well. But where can people go to find you?
I think the best way to connect with me right now is going to be through LinkedIn. If I have any free resources, I mean, I mentioned the content strategy checklist, like you will be able to find it there. So come check me out on LinkedIn.
That's awesome. And we can link that resource in our show notes. That would be cool.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Share with our listeners. Thank you so much for your time. And I loved hearing from you and learning from you. This has been so cool.
My pleasure. It was really fun. And I would love to come back. It was really fun. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Great. We'll see ya.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Content Logistics.
If you enjoyed listening, you can follow Content Logistics wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Or access all episodes at marketersindemand.com. Bye.